Free agency starts today for the Pelicans. And look, they're going to be active, but not in the way you think. I'll tell you how in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Let's go.
You are Locked On Pelicans, your daily New Orleans Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to another edition of Locked On Pelicans, the daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Pelicans and NBA, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, available wherever you get your podcasts and available on YouTube. I'm your host, Pelicans Insider, credential member of the media, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter. Here with y'all on this Monday. We got a lot to talk about this week. We're going to take a pause from the draft, though, to really look at free agency in the trade market, because that's where New Orleans can now try and improve their roster, and I think they're going to look to do just that. So we're going to cover it all in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans here. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. And of course, thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast and join over 11,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. You can also watch us on the Gulf Coast Sports and Entertainment Network every weekday at 10:30 a.m. Let's just get into this one here, because we're going to do a little bit of a dive on the Pelicans salary cap situation. So free agency starts today in the afternoon, and I'm excited. This is a fun time, a lot of players changing teams. It's going to be a weird year. I'm just going to prep you for this up front. Free agency is going to be really weird. You won't see massive deals getting handed out because only one team has cap space. So you're reliant on exceptions to be able to sign players. And you might have heard the phrase, the mid-level exception, before. Every team has one of those. There's actually 3 different mid-level exceptions. The one we're going to look for the Pelicans to potentially use is called the non-taxpayer mid-level exception. That is a contract that basically starts at $14.1 million for this coming season. You also have access to something called the biannual exception. It means you can use it every other year. That is $5.1 million here. And in tomorrow's show, we'll probably talk about trade exceptions and what that could mean for the team. We'll look at those a little bit later, but I want to focus on free agency and spending money right now. So just because they have $14.1 million to spend along with $5.11, you can't, add those two together and get about like $20 million. You can use that in separate transactions, and they've got to be separate, but you could break that 14.1 up in multiple ways. You could break that 5.1 up in multiple ways. The Pelicans probably aren't going to be doing that. However, when you look at some of the moves they made over the weekend, they did not pick up the team option on Elfrid Payton or Brandon Boston Jr. So where they stand right now is, if you count Micah Peavy, their second-round pick in this, they are at 14 players out of a 15-man roster. And to the luxury tax, they have about $11.5 million in room. Less important, but also important in this, is that first apron. If you are an everydayer, you've heard me mention that multiple times before. I have a show just breaking down the salary cap and what the first apron means. The Pelicans cannot go above the first apron. They're not going to get anywhere close to the first apron in the first place. They're about $18.2 million from that. But look, this is a team, one of two in NBA history, that has never paid the luxury tax ever. So let's just call the luxury tax threshold more or less the number for the Pelicans. Is that a safe thing to say? It feels like that's a safe thing to say. That at the end of the year, they're not going to go above the luxury tax threshold. They're about $11.5 million from that right now. So keep in mind, they could spend that 14.1. It would put them in the luxury tax, but then they're going to probably be looking for another move to try and dump salary to get under the luxury tax threshold. So let's functionally call it 11.5, but they could go above it for 1 or 2 free agents should they need to. What I'm using this to say is, with one open roster spot and with $11.5 million to spend, they're not going to be doing a whole lot right now. The roster's a little wonky. I see somewhat of the vision of what they're trying to do, even if that vision is blurry. But they can add somebody here. And we'll get into the names in the next 2 segments of the show. But let's focus on like one player and not necessarily breaking this up. I do think someone like Jordan Hawkins could easily be traded from this team. Jose Alvarado as well. So that open up a roster spot and potentially clear some money. Potentially, not guaranteed. But with no cap space out there, look, guys are actually going to be kind of cheap in free agency for certain people. So I think it is going to be very interesting to see what ends up happening here. But if the Pelicans want to make a splash, some of the names we're going to say sound good in theory, but if you want to make a splash and really upgrade the roster, it's going to be via trade and not through free agency here. And that's why we're going to do tomorrow's show on those TPEs, traded player exceptions, and why that's kind of important, because that's maybe how the Pelicans are going to be operating. They're going to lose one of those really soon. It's not the biggest deal, all things considered. So now they have more. They've done a good job of navigating what was a tricky salary cap situation to at least have access to all of or most of the non-taxpayer mid-level exception at that $14.1 million. It almost seemed a certainty that they were going to waive Elfrid Payton. Not waiving, but not picking up his player or his team option. Same thing for Brandon Boston Jr. He was signed in the middle of the year. You could, not pick up that team option and then still negotiate with him either on a longer term contract or one a little bit cheaper, which would be closer to the veteran minimum for his year. It'd save the team about $200K or so. And look, we're kind of at the point where like every penny matters for the Pelicans. So that wouldn't be the worst thing to do. And one of the reasons also why they might look to try and not use that non-taxpayer mid-level exception and try and acquire someone via trade into one of their traded player exceptions is that also that non-taxpayer mid-level exception basically lasts through like the middle of April. That if there's a buyout candidate later in the year, you can sign them using the non-taxpayer mid-level exception for more than, say, a minimum amount. You can also acquire players via trade into your non-taxpayer mid-level exception and all of that. So not using that and maybe trying to acquire a player via trade versus free agency, especially because when we get into some of the names here, it's not incredible, truthfully. It seems to make more sense for the Pelicans to kind of keep all options open. So I wouldn't be shocked, not guaranteeing it, if that's the way they go. I also would not be shocked if there's someone they're going to basically agree to a deal with immediately tomorrow. There's a very clear need for another big here. And Joe Dumars at his post-draft media availability said, we're probably looking for another big. The bigs on the team right now at the center spot are Derek Queen, who's kind of in between a 4 and a 5, right? He's like a 4.5, but not being a stretch guy, along with Yves Missi. And then at the 4, right, you have Zion, you have Carlo, who can play a little bit of small ball 5 for you as well. And that's kind of it. Maybe Trey at the 4-2, but you don't really have a lot of front court depth. You have decent wing depth and you have decent guard depth, in my opinion, once DeJounte Murray comes back. So they're very clearly going to be targeting a big here. And so those are the names that we're going to look at the most. We'll get into the guards and Chris Paul a little bit later in the show. But coming up next, I've got a list of 9 big men that I think the Pelicans really could be looking at and maybe wanting to sign. So that is what we're going to look at coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Summer sports are in full swing, and whether you're all about baseball under the lights, golf on the green, or high-stakes soccer action, FanDuel is the best way to make every game more exciting. You're already following the action, so why not make it a little bit more thrilling with FanDuel? You can get in on the game while your friends are getting sunburned at the beach. Look, I've been using FanDuel for the Club World Cup. It's here in the U.S. It's been pretty fun to watch all the games. Some of the biggest club teams out there. You can get in on that action. They've got prop bets, they've got the spreads for the matches, whatever it is, and there's new daily promotions and fun ways to bet every single day, and it's easy to use. They have fast payouts, and it just makes everything must watch all of a sudden. So whether I'm placing a same game parlay or watching a bet ride into the 9th inning, FanDuel makes it feel like I'm part of the action. And if you're new to FanDuel, That's even better. New customers can bet just $5 and you're going to get $150 in bonus bets if your first bet wins. Just open the FanDuel app or visit FanDuel.com to get started. New customers can bet just $5 and you're going to get $150 in bonus bets if your first bet wins with FanDuel. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We are here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and join over 11,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. Become an everydayer. That means you listen Monday through Friday to the Locked On Pelicans podcast. And if you're an everydayer, let me know in the comments down below. And don't forget, you can watch us on Gulf Coast Sports and Entertainment every weekday at 10:30 a.m. Same place where you watch your Pelicans games. All right, they're looking to add a big. We know this, right? Like, I'm not breaking any news here when I tell you they are looking to add a big at all. They want to bring somebody in, and they need a little bit of front court depth. Whether that is power forward or center, they need to do something like that. So let's look at the two names that I would be immediately trying to go and get that I don't think realistically are what's going to be available to the New Orleans Pelicans. The first one is Brook Lopez of the Milwaukee Bucks, right? He's a 3-and-D rim protecting center. You need that guy. The Pelicans have needed that guy for a while. There's not a ton of them out there. I think Brook Lopez, even at his older age, right? He's closer to 40 than not, is not particularly slowing down. And with a game that has aged pretty gracefully and doesn't play like a big bruising style where you kind of worry about that, shoot some threes, blocks from some shots, and let's just call it a day and be happy here. He's the type of guy that, would fit in. Now, here's the thing. He's worth more than the non-taxpayer mid-level exception, the full one, right? So I don't know if the Pelicans are going to be able to get him, but there's no other money out there in free agency. So basically his options are re-sign with the Bucks or go take the full non-taxpayer mid-level exception. I'll tell you how the salary structure would work here. I think he likely goes back to the Bucks. I don't think the Bucks are trying, they're not tanking. They're not doing anything like that. They're looking to still be competitive. They need a Brook Lopez. So you're going to need to offer him something kind of friendly to Brook Lopez here. You could do something along the lines of, and this is going to be the case for a couple of players on these lists here. You could do the full non-taxpayer mid-level exception on a 2-year deal with the second year being a player option. So it's essentially a 1-year deal. Unless they get injured or it goes really poorly and then they can opt into it after. That would be about 2 years, right around $29 million for Brook Lopez with the second year of a player option as kind of a prove it. And hey, test free agency next year when maybe there's more money available. I think that's fair. I think that's the only way the Pelicans would get him. I would do that even at his age in a second. He doesn't have to start, but you could bring him off the bench. It gives you that other big man that you need that shoots threes, that rim protects, that you don't currently have on the roster. I think he ends up back on the Bucks, but that would be a great player to try and go and get. The other name that I really like is Santi Aldama from the Memphis Grizzlies. The problem here is he's a restricted free agent. Unless the Brooklyn Nets are going to just throw a big money offer at him, anything that's offered, the Memphis Grizzlies can just match and he stays there. So if Santi Aldama signs for, say, the full mid-level exception, all 4 years that you could do it for, Memphis can just match. And I feel like Memphis would match. The only way you can do this to try and get him is if you do it immediately. Like the first second you can, he agrees to it and signs that deal with the New Orleans Pelicans. Without getting too much into like the nitty-gritty on the salary cap, there's something called a cap hold. And you can just have a guy in a cap hold. He kind of just sits there. You don't need to do anything with him. And it allows you to get other business done first. And then you go and re-sign the guy with a cap hold kind of thing. Especially when their cap hold is smaller than the number that they were going to get. His cap hold's about $11 million. The Memphis Grizzlies need to re-sign Jaren Jackson Jr. or sign him to an extension. They need to get that done first before Santi Aldama does. If they do it where they sign Santi Aldama first, that screws up their books and maybe makes it so they can't sign Jaren Jackson Jr. to the extension that he would want or cut into the money. Well, if you make a restricted free agent an offer, their current team has 3 days to match it or not. So all of a sudden you put pressure on the Memphis Grizzlies to get a deal done with Jaren Jackson Jr. immediately or not. Kind of fun to mess with a division rival that way. But ultimately, I think he goes back to the Memphis Grizzlies. So a couple of other players that I do think are much more reasonable that you could go and get. And these are the guys that I would be looking to try and add. The first one is Luke Cornett I think this is a guy from the Boston Celtics who was pressed into a bunch of action last season. He's ended up starting 16 games, played in 73 of them in a little over 18 minutes. Look, 6 points per game, 5 rebounds. It's nothing that's like insanely special here, but he's shown the ability in the past to shoot threes, and you could use a guy like that. He's just a serviceable big man that adds some veteran presence that maybe the team is needing right now, given how young that they are. He would be pretty cheap, wouldn't command the full mid-level exception. That's kind of important here. $10 million a year for him, 2 years. That sounds like a pretty reasonable offer. You also have Kevon Looney from the Golden State Warriors. He's a small ball center, but he's switchable. He rebounds well. If you're just looking to add some depth, a spot starter here and there at the very worst, I think Kevon Looney is definitely a guy that you could go and get. He's not really a spacer. This is not someone that I think, teams are scared of. But look, he's been around for a minute. He's spent his entire career with the Golden State Warriors. He's a 3-time NBA champ. He averages 5.6 rebounds per game. He shot threes every now and then. Not really a three-point shooter at all. Per 36 minutes, his career numbers are 10.4 points and 11.8 rebounds. Like 10 and 12, that seems kind of fine over a 10-year career. He's never, played that amount of minutes regularly, so you wouldn't really want him doing that. He's probably at most a 20-minute per game guy, but that's kind of what you're looking for in terms of a depth piece, right? So, that's why I think someone like him, could make some sense for the New Orleans Pelicans as just a proven guy that you can trust as a small ball center that defends well enough, even if nothing particularly exciting. Another name that's really kind of only recently come back to the NBA is Gershon Yabusele. He was with the Philadelphia 76ers this past year. He played pretty well for them. And now all of a sudden they're kind of in a salary cap crunch and not in a great situation and uncertain of what they're going to do. He's more of, a power forward than center. He's 6'8", so he's smaller. But last year, 11 points per game, grabbed 5.6 rebounds, and he shot 38% from three. He's not blocking shots. This is not a rim protector or anything like that. I don't know if you're going to be able to get a rim protector necessarily, but for some cheap wing depth, I would definitely be aggressive going after Yabusele, but I do think he's probably going to get, other offers elsewhere. On the cheaper end of things, you could look at Luke Garza from Minnesota. He's switchable. He shoots threes. It's like a $6 million a year player. I think that's kind of, a good idea here. Another guy here is Sandro, and I'm going to butcher the last name here, Mamu Kelashvili from the San Antonio Spurs. They don't need a stretch big. 6.3 points per game last season, 37% from three. He can grab a couple of rebounds. Look, if you want a switchable stretch big, that's who it is. He's 6'11". He's got decent size. I think he's a guy that I think could be useful that, might cost a little bit more than some of the other names we've mentioned, but is certainly an option out there if you're looking for kind of cheap depth. Two more names here in this segment for you. One is Day'Ron Sharpe from the Nets. He's an undrafted free agent after getting no restricted free agent tender from the Brooklyn Nets. He's worth a flyer on. I don't really know what his contract would be, truthfully. But as a center that gave you 8 points and 7 rebounds per game last season, that's again, it's a depth piece. That's what you're looking for here when it comes to it, unless you're getting Brook Lopez or Santi Aldama. The other one is Mo Wagner from the Orlando Magic. There we go. He's just like a dick. If you want just a jerk on the team that's going to piss off opponents, he's your guy. He's coming off an ACL injury that's kept him out for most of the year. That's not great, but you'd be able to sign him cheap. He's just kind of got that mean streak, which it seems like Joe Dumars maybe wants to kind of add to the team. Might be worth a buy low candidate here. Couple other names that I want to get into next. What about the backcourt on the wing? I've got 4 names for you that I think could be interesting, though I don't think it's the direction the Pelicans go. Let's talk about Chris Paul. I'm even going to throw Russell Westbrook out here at y'all. Let's talk about it. It's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and join over 11,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well and become an everydayer. That means you listen Monday through Friday to the Locked On Pelicans podcast. For your second listen, it's Locked On Saints with host Ross Jackson, making sense of everything black and gold. He's going to be out in California for the preseason games, for those practices that they're doing away from the team. Boots on the ground kind of guy here. Make Locked On Saints your second listen today. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So let's keep talking about free agency here for the New Orleans Pelicans. You know, they are going to be looking to add one name. They can make some other moves, and we'll look at some bigger ones in tomorrow's show that you would use other methods of acquiring for, including not sending out a player. That's kind of important, right? Let's start with a name that's on everybody's mind, and that's Chris Paul. You know, before you drafted Jeremiah Fears, you needed a point guard. That makes a ton of sense. Chris Paul makes a ton of sense at the time. Now, a little bit less so, and I'll explain why. You might be going, no, like, look, get Jeremiah Fears a mentor in Chris Paul. And I go, I totally get it except for one thing, and this is going to be a show itself a little bit later. Hypothetically, I want to leave it at that. You sign Chris Paul, and look, maybe they're going to make a run at him. You sign Chris Paul. Will Jeremiah Fears play with head coach Willie Green, who, this is why it's going to be a whole show, right? Doesn't have a contract after this year. He's kind of coaching for his job. Is he going to lean on a barely like 18, 19-year-old rookie, or Chris Paul, who he played with, who he coached with the Phoenix Suns, right? Rather than the rookie. And while I love Chris Paul, you need to make sure you have pathways to your rookies playing. You know, are the Pelicans kind of setting themselves up for failure with two rookies under a head coach that needs to win now, on a team that needs to win now? Because you don't control your first round. You don't have a first round pick next year. That's not an ideal situation. In a weird way, you need to take pieces away from your head coach so he's forced to play the rookies, right? That's kind of what they need to look at this with. So Chris Paul makes tons of sense, except you're burying your prized rookie 7th overall pick on the bench even more. Is that actually smart? If that's the case, why not just trade the 7th pick away and get somebody better? It kind of leaves, that's where some of the moves are. At times you look at this roster and go, what are they trying to accomplish? Again, I kind of see it, I do. And even then, Fears would have a role, but you've got to make sure he gets minutes, right? You've got to go out of your way to do that. I think that's partially why you waived didn't pick up team options on 2 guards. Plus, I just don't expect Chris Paul to come here. He seems like he wants to go more closer to the West Coast, where he's kind of based out of Los Angeles. You know, I think he wants to try and win a title. He's going to be ring chasing. I just don't see that being here in New Orleans as great of a reunion as it would be, in as much as I think that would be awesome. And having that veteran presence on the team could be important. You are very young now. There's no one above 28, 29 on the Pelicans roster anymore. You know, is there a lack of leadership? That's a whole show I got planned too. I got content for days for y'all here. Speaking of that, we're not going to be dropping to 3 days a week this offseason. It's going to remain 5 days a week. No break here at the Locked On Pelicans podcast. So Chris Paul, just don't expect it. Look, make a call to say you did it, but I wouldn't expect Chris Paul to be coming here. You know, I think you could maybe get him for the full mid-level exception. Maybe that's just the number that no one else is going to offer and he can't say no to. But I wouldn't be shocked if you saw him back on the Phoenix Suns, on the Los Angeles Clippers, or even in some capacity with the Lakers or something like that. You know, the other big name that I can throw out at you here would be Russell Westbrook. He'd be cheaper than Chris Paul. I don't think he would need as big of a role as Chris Paul would. And he's also, well, not the same kind of player as Jeremiah Fears. One, connections to Troy Weaver, who was, you know, the big proponent of drafting him in Oklahoma City when Troy Weaver worked there. So maybe they want a reunion of sorts. And we've seen Troy Weaver likes the connections directly to him, whether that's, you know, the DC metro area or guys he drafted or was involved with in the past. So Russell Westbrook, just that downhill attacking point guard, you know, to play some backup point guard minutes, maybe in the event that you trade a Jose Alvarado away, which would suck. But you could bring him in, and, you know, he's the type of guy that could teach a thing or two to Jeremiah Fears. Fears' greatest skill is getting downhill. Get ready for this one. You won't believe what I'm going to say. I have a whole show planned about that. I have a stat on him that you won't even believe, and I think it's the most important stat regarding him. So Westbrook could be kind of a good mentor. He he gets painted in a bad light, I think. He gets thrown under the bus a ton when it comes to like teams not having success, and they try and blame it on him. But like literally every teammate he's ever had is like, this dude is the best. I think he's a great locker room guy. He'd be a fun player. He's a name player that would generate some interest in the Pelicans too. There's that. But truthfully, no guard makes a ton of sense for the team right now. Look, you take a flyer on Jason Tate from the Houston Rockets. He's certainly going to be gone from them. Defense first guy, iffy offense. If you want to kind of add some toughness or some more defense, because this team is very offensively skewed right now outside of Herb Jones. He's a guy that, like, sure, for cheap, if you end up maybe jettisoning out someone like Jordan Hawkins, you could bring in Jason Tate and like somebody else, and that's a way to kind of add some better depth to your roster, or at least add a little bit more defense than you've had. He's a guy that, like, sure, I think could make some sense for this team. Cameron Payne, is the type, similar kind of idea. If you just want someone who's established, someone that Willie Green is going to trust and play, again, he's point guard that's burying Jeremiah Fears, who you could argue should start for the team. We'll see if that ends up happening or not. But that's kind of the position the Pelicans are in. None of the guards make a ton of sense to me. The wings out there really aren't particularly great. I think you're looking at a big, whether it's Brook Lopez, Aldama, Cornette, Looney. I think Mo Wagner, even with that injury, is a guy that makes a ton of sense. I don't mind Luke Garza as just a super cheap option. You could potentially break that mid-level exception up and sign multiple guys using, $7 million and $7 million and get two of them. You have a roster crunch there, but you can figure that out if you need to. And look, you can go into the luxury tax and then trade away a guy and do someone else's traded player exception or something like that. So there's some flexibility here in a way that they haven't exactly had in a while. But don't look for the Pelicans to be making big name splashes in free agency. Notice I didn't put Jonathan Kuminga or anyone like that in here, because none of that's really going to make like a ton of sense. And you're seeing a lot of the big names already kind of get snapped up by their current team. So we'll see what happens this afternoon. Looking forward to it. Tomorrow, we'll look at traded player exceptions, guys they could go and sign that way, trade for that way. We'll look at leadership. I want to talk about Jeremiah Fears, Derek Queen, and Micah Peavy more. We got a lot of content coming here on the Locked On Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, as always. I'm your host, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter. This is the Locked On Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'll see y'all tomorrow.